Okay. All right, we are on the book of John. We have come almost to the middle of the gospel, and I hope that you have been learning and trying that for John, and that there are things that you were not aware of, and now then you have a better appreciation for this gospel. Now, it's been quite a while and that we have been doing John's Gospel, and sometimes and it might be important and helpful, and to have go back and have a review, have go back and have a overview of what this gospel is all about. And one of the things that you'll notice that John's gospel is very different from the other three gospels. And Matthew, Mark, and Luke tends to focus more on the what we call the gospel, the teachings, and the good news that Jesus brings about the gospel of the kingdom and what he did and exemplify that gospel and that gospel as well. John tends to have a different agenda, and he can not completely different, but probably the same in a way. He does say is that he is writing these things so that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And but he is writing at a time when all the other three gospels are probably written and well circulated. And he was writing, as some would say, a spiritual gospel. And John's method and tends not to follow a strict chronological outline, but following themes that he and sharing and dealing with to people who are already probably well acquainted with the outline of Jesus' life, Jesus' ministry. And so he's not trying to correct them. He's not trying to replace them, but he's trying to show them something that he and want us to know and with from a different angle who Jesus is. And you'll find that there are two parts of the gospel. The first part is the book of Signs, chapter 1 to 12. And then chapter 13, what we call the book of glory. And after the prologue, section on John the Baptist, the first four chapters and the first two chapters and the first and three chapters there. And he deals with what we call the institutions of Judaism, ritual purification, that is at the wedding, the temple, and then the rabbi and the holy well. And then the second section from chapter 5 to chapter 10, he deals with how the various festivals of Judaism and were avenues and were means by which Jesus revealed as to who he is. So we have chapter 5 on the Sabbath, the Passover on chapter 6, and chapter 7, which is one of the most important and festivals of the Jewish people, and probably we can say the most joyful of the Jewish festivals that they have even today, and Sukkoth, and so Tabernacles, chapter 7, chapter 9. Now we come to chapter 10, the Feast of Dedication. All right. So right now, let's look at okay. So you find that the Feast of Dedication is mentioned here, and what we call Hanukkah. And now some of you then probably may have heard and aware, and of course probably you then know about what we call the Jewish festivals and the Passover and the Tabernacles, and there are a lot of what we call then Christians who want to go and follow Jewish and methods and basically go to the Old Testament, but they don't really know what to do with Hanukkah. And because Hanukkah is not found exactly in the Old Testament, all right? But it is an important festival that Jews and in Jesus' time and even today do celebrate. Jews do not celebrate Christmas Day, and but they have what we call then a similar kind of festival. Then not similar, but they, if you go to America, you find that sometimes they combine Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and that is not the Jewish equivalent of Christmas. Okay, it is a different what we call then setting. Hanukkah means dedication. All right. So came the festival of dedication at Jerusalem and was winter. Sukkoth or Feast of Tabernacles is probably around September, October. And this year was particularly in what we call I won't say memorable because the attack of the Hamas upon the Israel and the kidnapping was on the last day of Sukkoth and October 7th. Sukkoth basically end on October 6th. Hanukkah is about 3 months later, so it's about Christmas time, around Christmas time. This year is earlier in the first week of December, and so there's probably a 3 months gap. And now, what is Hanukkah? Hanukkah is a festival commemorating what we call the dedication, or more accurately, the rededication of the temple. Specifically, the rededication of the second temple. The first temple of Solomon was destroyed by the Babylonians, and the Israelites and the Jews were taken to exile in Babylon in around the early part of the 6th century BC. They were in Babylon captivity after repeated warnings, warnings by God to repent, and they don't repent. Finally, God kind of get fed up with them. And Jeremiah says that God is going to send you all to exile. The people did not believe Jeremiah. They believed that as long as they have a temple, as long as they do the temple worship, and the temple worship was very grand during that time, and it's very well attended, and there were, and but the the nation is basically a nation that's gone away from God and doing things that God despised, and no justice and a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of ritual, but no real integrity. So God basically gave them over to the Babylonians. And God says, you will go in exile for 70 years. Shortly before, and they didn't go to exile for 70 years, but that is a kind of, probably about 50, 60 years later, then or even 40 years later, they were allowed to come back. And coming returned from exile, what we call the restoration, and took place in the later part of the 6th century BC, about 520 something or 30 something. And there were various waves of coming. Nehemiah, Ezra, and you read the Bible, this is the time when they will return. Now, the occasion for the return is that the Babylonians, who were their captors, were overthrown by the Persians. So the Persians overthrew Babylonians, and Cyrus, who was a new emperor, the new king, and proclaimed a release of all the exiles, not only of the Jews, but also of other nationalities, other peoples. They were allowed to go back. Now, they didn't come back to Jerusalem, to Judea as an independent nation. They basically traded the Babylonian rule to the Persian rule. Now, the Persians are a little bit more tolerant and allow freedom of worship, and even helped in the rebuilding of the temple. We have Nehemiah, how he got permission to return to rebuild the temple, not rebuild the temple, rebuild the walls, and Ezra rebuild the temple. And during the time of Haggai and Zechariah, they rebuilt the temple that is called the Second Temple. And for about 200 years, and the Jews were under the Persian, doing pretty well, and they have a certain kind of autonomy in terms of religion and worship. They were under the high priest, and but in terms, probably also a civil administrator, but there is a governor a Persian governor who is appointed over and that part of the world. Now, Palestine and Judea is a very small area. The larger area is Syria. So the Syria region with Palestine included is under what we call the Persian, under what we call a Persian government. However, the Persians, you know the history about Alexander the Great, fell to Alexander. Alexander the Great in the 4th century and defeated the Persians. And if you know a movie about Alexander the Great, and there was the Persian, defeated the Persian, and the Greeks, then Alexander, Macedonians defeated the Persian, and then extended the empire all the way to India. So around the 4th century, then Palestine or then Judea come under the domain of the Macedonian or the Greek Empire. Now, even though Alexander was Macedonian and in a Macedonian, but he has embraced Greek culture. So part of his mission, part of his aim was to establish Greek culture and Greek learning and Greek influence throughout the then known world, the Western world, and it really took place. And so there are many cities named Alexandria called Alexandria. The most famous one is in Egypt, and that is still to the day. And but Alexander did not live very long. He died very quickly, and when was still in the 30s. Some say was poisoned. Some say of his kind of hedonistic and living. He died, and then the empire broke up into various different parts. The Bible basically says it is 4 parts, and probably 4 major regions, but there are also many sub-regions as well, because there's not only what we call 4 main generals, but there are also sub-generals and other, so they have different autonomies all over. But the two and nations and Greek dynasties and that came and to be influenced over the Jewish people was the one in Syria that is called the Seleucid Empire, and the one is in Egypt called the Ptolemaic Empire. In the beginning of the Greek period, and Judea is under the governance of the Ptolemaic dynasty. But the Greeks also fought with one another, and somehow then Syria, that Seleucid, overthrew and then and beat up and the what we call the south. And you can read that being prophesied or being reported in the book of Daniel, the kings of the north, the kings of the south. And Daniel chapter 11, you have a sense of that happening over there. Now, when this was during this time, Greek influence began to spread, and not all over the Mediterranean, including Judea. And many of the Jews began to be influenced by Greek culture and took on Greek and learning and study under the Greeks, adopted Greek customs and all that. Just like, then a lot of Chinese and a lot of Indians and took over when the British came, then basically we become westernized, we learn English. And one reason why I'm teaching this in English, not in Mandarin, is part of this, what we call the influence of the British Empire. And in those days, and the Greek culture became basically the empire that ruled the world, the Western world, so to speak. And so in Judea and in Jerusalem, more and more people became very Greek and began to lose their religious affiliation. And many of the customs became forgotten, and basically they began to do and take on Greek, and they are still Jews. They are still faithful to the Torah, but become very Greek-like. And so some of them even go to the point, and probably even the majority, I would say, and no longer speak Greek also know to speak Hebrew, which is or Aramaic, and largely Greek speaking. So the Bible, the Old Testament, was translated into Greek. So in the New Testament time, you have the Old Testament called the Septuagint. And now things was okay as long as things, but then one of the Syrian king, the Seleucid king, and for whatever reason that we don't go into that, and decided to impose absolute, what we call, try to have uniformity in his empire and want to abolish the Jewish religion. Is something like in Mahathir, you're Malaysians, you must speak Malay, then you must be Muslim, then you cannot be Chinese, you cannot be Indian, you cannot be a Christian, then so that kind of these things happen from time to time in history, and so Antiochus and the fourth began to impose on this, and there was a rebellion of the Jewish people, the faithful ones. And they are the precursors. They were before the Pharisees and the Sadducees came to being, you have what we call the Hasidim, and they are what we call what we call the holy ones, and they revolted. And then there was a group that's more military, and Matthias and his son Judas Maccabeus, and it came to the head when Antiochus, the Seleucid, the Greek king, desecrated the temple and tried to make it what we called and profane it by sacrificing a pig on the high altar in the temple. And when the pig, not only the Muslims, but even more the Jews, is considered unclean, unholy, and so defiled the temple to stop the Jews from, and so they suspended temple worship, temple sacrifices. And then he banned all Jewish practices, including circumcision. Within very soon, we called Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, and following his father, and rebelled. And after a series of years, they overthrew and gained what we call limited independence, and for what we call the Jewish people in AD 165 BC, and they conquered and in Jerusalem they took over the temple and they rededicated the temple, and so Hanukkah is called and is celebrating that event. The practice of Hanukkah, the festival, and lasted 8 days because of the story that the candles and in the temple burned uninterrupted for 8 days. And so you'll find that if you go to Jerusalem, you'll find you have the Jewish candlestick, the menorah. There are two types of menorah. The traditional menorah, the Torah menorah, has 7 candlesticks. And that is the one that is used for what we call the Jewish temple menorah. Then they have another menorah, which is probably even more popular, with 8 candles. And that came from the period of the Maccabees, and where there was the candles and burnt for 8 days. The oil burned for 8 days, and that was a remembrance of that. So if you go to Jerusalem, you buy a menorah bag. Is this 7 candlesticks or 8 candlesticks? One is the Hanukkah menorah. The other one is the Torah menorah. Okay. Now, the problem with the Maccabees is that they started well, but later, within 100 years or so, they became corrupt, and they became more like the Greeks that they had overthrown, and they basically have they became despised even by the Jewish people themselves. And until such a point that they could not resolve the internal struggles, they invited the Romans to intervene. The Romans happily came in and took over. And in 40 BC, the Romans basically annexed Judea and placed a non-Jew Edomite and a king and over the Jewish nation. That's where you got King Herod and in 40 BC. All right. Now, the point of the what we call all this is to give you a setting of what is happening here. And when Jesus basically then talks about and the good shepherd, okay, uh, in the temple in Jesus' day, in what we call the celebration of what we call the Hanukkah, it is not only a celebration of the deliverance that the Maccabees had, but also and a reflection of how the Maccabeans and themselves became corrupt and became what we call bad leaders and brought about a situation that the end was even worse than the beginning. And in the beginning, they were under the Greeks. At the end, they were under the Romans. And the Jews during Jesus' time, were really, really very unhappy because they are no longer a free nation under Roman authority. And the Romans are even worse than the Greeks. And so the service during what we call the Feast of Dedication of Hanukkah, and also had a reflection of the failure and of the Maccabees and the Hasmonean dynasty, the family, that they were not good shepherds. And one of the texts, and basically the main text, and one of the readings that they have and sermons that they have is taken from Ezekiel. And Ezekiel 34 has become basically part of the main liturgy for the celebration. And of course, this is during Ezekiel's time, but here, and this text is directed against what we call the people of God, the people of Israel, and how they were unfaithful, and against the leaders of Israel, how they were unfaithful. So the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who need to take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flocks? You eat the curds, clothe yourself with wool, slaughter the choice animals, but you don't take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak or healed the sick or bound. So you have ruled them harshly, and they were scattered because there was no shepherd. Then verse 7, and surely as I live, because my flock lacks a shepherd and so plundered, and therefore then basically I'm against the shepherds, hold them accountable. And verse 11, I myself will search for my sheep and look after them, and so on and so on. So this became largely the background and for Jesus' sermon and Jesus and the teaching and Jesus' parable on the Good Shepherd. Many of us probably, when you read this passage, we know about Jesus, the Good Shepherd. We refer to Psalm 23, and Jesus, the Good Shepherd, he's kind, it's all this thing and all that. And probably none of you, I think, I'm quite pretty sure, did not realize the background for Jesus coming and talking about that he is the Good Shepherd. Okay? And basically, Jesus used this occasion, the Feast of Dedication, warning the people of Israel against bad leaders, bad shepherds. The word shepherd later become what we call a symbol for leadership. And in the church, the leader of a church is called a pastor. The word pastor actually means shepherd. It comes from the Latin word pastorate, which is a shepherd. So you are shepherds, and so then when you call the pastor a pastor, actually you are calling him shepherd. All right. Now, so this section is about Jesus being the good shepherd as opposed to who? The Pharisees, who were being bad shepherds and bad leaders of the people. Now, the problem with John chapter 10 has a little bit of what we call how do you divide John chapter 10? Because if you read chapter 9 and then chapter 10, you'll find that there's very little what we call an interruption. So the Pharisees heard him. They say, "What are we? Are we blind too? If you are blind, you'll be not guilty of sin, but now you claim your guilt begin." And very truly, I tell you, Pharisees, anyone who does not enter the ship. So it seems chapter 9, chapter 10 seems to be a continuation of chapter 9. And chapter 9 is about a Feast of Tabernacles. Okay. And then you'll find that all the way down, and verse 21 seems to tie in with what we call the earlier chapter 9, when others says when there was a so-called dispute, and are the sayings of man these are not the sayings of man possessed by a demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? So chapter 9 has to do with Jesus healing the blind man. So some people will say, well, this first part of chapter 10 belongs largely connected with chapter 9. Now, this you need to note that when John wrote this gospel, there are no chapter divisions. The chapter divisions were added later on by Christians, and later on in the church, in the Western church, Latin church, largely, and probably in the middle of the 13th, 14th century, very late. And so in the original, there's no such thing as chapter divisions and all that. In those days, they don't need chapter divisions because only the scholars, the priests, and all that, and read scripture and know the scripture, and they know where the scriptures texts are and all that, and they didn't really need any help. But when the printing was made, and people began to study the Bible more and more available to people, then people need help, and so chapter divisions. So then it helps, because if I were to preach, I'm going to say, okay, turn to John chapter 10. If I were then doing in those earlier days, I said, okay, let's talk about a story in John's gospel where he talks about the shepherd, and people are wondering where it is. So chapter divisions is helpful, and especially for those who are not very familiar with the Bible. So in one sense, there is a good argument for the first part of chapter 10 to be connected with chapter 9. However, some would argue, no, chapter 9 has a talk about light. Chapter 10, and beginning verse 1, Jesus seems to have started a new topic about being a shepherd. All right. And then you find that largely what we call, even though the term Feast of the Dedication was mentioned only at verse 22, you find that later on, you'll find that after 22, Jesus is still talking about being a shepherd. And you do not believe me because you are not my sheep. So there is good reason for certain scholars and to try to make it thematically, the chapter 10 should be unified, focus on the shepherd. But a compromise can be made in that the first part of chapter 10 could be a kind of a transition, looking backwards to chapter 9, and then looking forwards to chapter 10, the later part. All right. Now, that is probably not that very important for those of you who are not necessarily then going to be pastors and scholars and all that. You are just going to be reading the Bible and all. Anyway, the section in chapter 10 can be divided into very discrete sections. First, there is the parable. Jesus I say to you, anyone who does not enter the sheep pen by the gate, but climbs by another way, is a thief and a robber. The one who enters by the gate is a shepherd of the sheep. The gatekeeper opens the gate for him. The sheep listens to his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he has brought out his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because he knows his voice. but they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. Those who know about situation about shepherds, about sheep in Palestine, in Arab countries, will find that this is very, very true to the situation. They don't have sheep farms like New Zealand, Australia, when you have thousands and thousands of sheep. And most shepherds will probably have about 30, 40, or 50 sheep. And the sheep is intimately related to the shepherd. A very recent incident, not too long ago, and during what we call not the recent conflict, but the earlier conflict, and between the Palestinians and Israelis. And in one village, there was this big and kind of thing, and uprising, and the Israeli soldiers came and locked down the village and collect all the sheep and put them into the sheep pen. Okay, and then and soldiers in charge of the sheep. Then one woman came up to the soldier and says that, and we are poor and we don't have anything. Then you have locked up all our sheep and we're going to suffer a great deal. And so then, would you allow me to bring out my sheep? And the soldier laughed and says, the sheep, all the sheep that we have caught from all the village, how do you know who are yours? And so this woman says, well, if I can demonstrate to you and show you, then who is mine, would you let me keep the sheep? And the soldier said, okay, kind of laughed and says, okay. So the woman called her son, and he took a flute and he played the song, a music. And miraculously, to the astonishment of the Israel soldier, 30 sheep came out of the pen following the music of the boy leading out of the sheep pen. My sheep knows my voice. Then they follow me, they will not follow a stranger. That is a situation that you have. Now, Jesus told this parable, and this is something that they know. But when Jesus used this as a figure of speech in verse 6, they say that Jesus used this figure of speech, but the Pharisees did not understand what he was telling them. Now, of course, the Pharisees, being the Jews, understand the situation. It's not that they don't know about sheep, they don't know about shepherd, but they have no clue to why Jesus is telling this parable. What is Jesus really talking about? And sometimes I scratch my head and I say, huh? These people so dumb one. But it's possible that they were so spiritually blinded and they couldn't figure out, and their lack of understanding is not intellectual, not something that, but probably they refused and then to see how Jesus using this shepherd kind of thing and against them, and or Jesus using this parable and which they are using what we call the shepherds and all that, and they believed, the Pharisees believed they were good shepherds. And the Maccabees are the ones who mess it up. But they are the descendants of the Hasidim, the dedicated ones. And so for them to put into the place of the bad guys, they just couldn't accept it and couldn't understand what Jesus is saying. Then Jesus explained the parable. Okay, now, it's interesting how Jesus is very creative in telling the parable. And he shifts, in the beginning of the story, he says that the shepherd enters by the gate. Okay, anyone who enters another way is a thief and a robber. Okay, so the gatekeepers opens for him, and the sheep listen to his voice. Now, Jesus says in verse 7, I am the gate for the sheep. Those who come before me are thieves and robbers, but sheep have not listened to him. I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief only comes to steal, kill, and destroy. I have come that they might have life and they might have little food. So there is a change. Now Jesus is talking about he's not the shepherd, but he is the gate. And the gate, basically, he's the one to whom you approach God. And you approach and you basically then come to salvation. And then he goes back, and verse 11, I am the good shepherd. And now he describes what is the characteristic of a good shepherd. A good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. The hireling is not a shepherd. He doesn't own a sheep. When he sees the wolves coming, he abandons the sheep, runs away. The wolf attacks and scatters it. The man who runs away because he has hired hand, the man runs away because he has hired hand and doesn't care for the sheep. So a real shepherd, a good shepherd, is the one who cares for the sheep. A hired hand, he doesn't really care for the sheep. He's there just for the job. And when the wolf comes to attack, he doesn't really care for the sheep. He runs away. I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep knows me, as the Father knows me, and I know the Father. I lay my life down for the sheep. Then verse 16, something very remarkable happens. And Jesus says, I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, that there should be one flock and one shepherd. And this is a clear indication that even at the very beginning, Jesus see the other sheep. If you understand the situation in John's gospel, in John's time, the other sheep will be the Gentiles. They are not Jews, we are the Gentiles, and to be brought and become one people. Okay. The reason my Father loves me is that I lay down my life and only to take it up again. There's a reference to the resurrection and Jesus dying on the cross. Jesus laid down his life. Then he alone had authority to take it up again. No one takes it from me. I do it from my own accord. I have authority to lay down and authority to take it up again. This command I received from my Father. Now, John wants to be very clear or tells us Jesus' death, Jesus' crucifixion is not something that was because of the circumstances and of the authorities and of the Jewish leaders and who arrested him and all that. And then his resurrection is not God's plan B, because he was arrested, so God had rescue plan. This was all God's plan from the very beginning. And the Jews, when they heard all of this, and probably couldn't really understand what he's saying, but it was saying that the Father loves me, and I take it down, and the Jews who heard these words were again divided. So leaders and people, many people say he's demon possessed, he's raving mad. Why listen to him? But others said these are not the sayings of a man possessed by demon. Can a demon open the eyes of the blind? So again, earlier we see how Jesus' words have always divided the people. They saw his miracles, but then he said words that are very, very difficult for religious, pious Jews to accept. He makes him to make himself one with God. Okay. Then came the Feast of Dedication, and this is probably the indication that this is this time. And it was winter, and Jesus was in the temple walking in the colonnade, and the Jews were gathered there around him. How long would you keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly. Very clearly, John wants us to see that the audience and the people in the first part, before verse 21, and the people after verse 22 are the same people, the same group of people. And so there is this interconnection between these two parts of the passage. It was winter. Winter is cold, and we were in Jerusalem about almost 20 years ago, I think, and we were there probably in early spring, before late winter, early spring. It was very cold, and in Jerusalem, Jerusalem is on a kind of a hill, and is Mount Zion is up on the hill, and it can be very, very cold. And so it was winter, Jews on temple courts, and the colonnade is the kind of the pillars that surround the temple and the Solomon temple, and it provides cover for what we call people to gather together. So the Jews would gather around him, and they were there, and Jesus was there. How long would you keep us in suspense? If you're the Messiah, tell us plainly. So Jesus always spoke in parables, in dark sayings, and all that, and the Jews were kind of, how long? They're kind of annoyed. How long are you going to keep us in suspense? Jesus answered, I already told you. I did tell you, but you don't believe me. You do not believe. The works I do in my Father's name testify about me. But you don't believe me because you don't believe because they're not my sheep. My sheep listen to my voice. I know them, and they follow me. I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. No one will snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all. No one can snatch them out of my Father's hand. I am the Father of one. Jesus protects his sheep. Okay, this passage has been used by Calvinists and to talk about eternal security and all that. I think that is not what Jesus is trying to say. And basically, Jesus says, I know my sheep, I protect my sheep, I take care of my sheep. That is a very general statement. And those who knows Jesus, and Jesus will protect them, and that is that kind of a security that is there. Again, the Jewish and opponents pick up stones to stone him. Jesus said, I have shown you many good works from the Father. Which of these for which of you to stone me? And they replied, we are not stoning for any good work, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God. And the Jews, and later on you'll find that the Jews and do not have the right to execute anyone for capital punishment, and but the punishment and for them is a stoning, and they wanted wanted they pick up because kind of a mob action. They pick up stone to stone him, and blasphemy, and Jesus is putting himself so high that he's almost equal to God, claiming to be God. And just answer them from Psalm 82. Okay, if we look at Psalm 82, it's a very interesting psalm. Okay, this is a psalm, the Psalm of Asaph. God presided in great assembly, he rendered judgment among the gods. How long will you defend the just and show partiality to the wicked? Defend the weak and the fatherless, uphold the cause of the poor, the oppressed, and rescue the weak and the needy, and deliver them from the hand of the wicked. And this gods here seems to be a reference to rulers or judges, and they are referred to as gods, so to speak, because they hold the power over life and death. And so they were unjust, and they were not doing their work well, but they were called, he renders judgment on gods. And he said, this God, the gods know nothing, they understand nothing, they walk about in darkness, all the foundations of the earth are shaken. I said, you are gods, yes. You're all sons of the Most High. But you will die, mere mortals. You will fly, die by every other ruler. Rise up, oh God, judge the earth for the nations inherit. This is a very interesting psalm. And because human beings are referred to as gods, okay? And not literally, but more or less figuratively, because they have the power. And but Jesus is not using expound. He's using that as, say, isn't it written in your law or the Torah and the Bible? I have said that you are gods, Psalm 82. And the rabbis and rabbinic interpretation of that day thinks that the psalm was written in the context of the Exodus, and when God said to the people, to the leaders, you are gods or sons of God, and things like that. If he called them gods to whom the word of God came and scripture cannot be set aside, what about the one whom the Father set apart from his own and sent to the world? Why then do you accuse me of blasphemy? Because I'm God's son. Do not believe me unless I do the works of my Father. But if I do them, even though you do not believe in me, believe the works, so that you may know and understand the Father is in me and I am the Father. Again, they tried to seize him. But again, he escaped their grasp because the time is not yet come. Jesus has a divine timetable. There's a time for everything. This is not a time, and God protected him on that. This is the last public and teaching of Jesus in John's gospel. And the thing is this, it came to a very, very terrible end. The people still not only don't believe, they try to arrest Jesus, kill Jesus, and do it with Jesus. Then verse 40, Jesus went back across the Jordan to the place where John was baptizing in the early days, and there he stayed. So here, Jesus started from the ministry in John the Baptist, the place. Now he comes full circle and goes back to the place in Jordan where John, there he stayed until the time comes for him to be revealed again. But many people came to him, and they say, though John never performed a sign, this is the last statement in John's gospel about John the Baptist, though John never performed a sign, a miracle, all that John said about this man is true. And in that place, many believed in Jesus. So there again, many tried to kill Jesus, many tried to arrest Jesus, many tried to do it with Jesus, but many people, on the other hand, believe in Jesus as well. Okay. All right. Okay. I think I went very fast. It's okay. And